Tenzin Dorjee, he's a writer, poet, and he, I think, more than anyone else, he really represents the new phase of the Tibetan freedom struggle and the new phase of Tibetan youth in a way. And he was, he's from the generation of Tibetans born and raised in exile in India, studied in Tibetan children's village in Dharamsala. So basically a product of exile, but he traveled to India after he finished his college. He walked to the North Indian border, Ladakh area, and he actually walked to Tibet. And he nearly died from that experience because he was walking in the highest, desert pretty much. And he ran out of food. In the end, he sort of, ended up being arrested by the border police, and he ended up in jail in Tibet for about a month. And in the end, because he was not a citizen of China, and also because he was not a citizen of India, he was in this strange position. And the Chinese government didn't really know what to do with him. In the end, he was handed back to the Indian police. And so he's back in India again, but he's a very well-known, highly respected writer and now, leader of the Tibetan freedom struggle. Puchung Sonam, also a writer. I think his books are outside on the table. And he was born in Tibet, came to India when he was very, very young. And I think more recently, just last year, he was a Fulbright scholar at Emerson College. So he's back in Dharamsala right now, working in the Tibetan government. Tenzin Dorjee, one of our friends, who's actually a unique character called the Tibetan modern contemporary painter. And much like Jungbo over there, who's a photographer and a painter, Jungbo is actually the guy who designed the logo for...
You should make him stand up too.
Yeah. Jungbo, can you stand up for a second? He designed the logo for this event. This beautiful logo that's outside at the door. So Rigdel and Jungbo, I think they grew up together in TCV, and I think they got kicked out of school together too, right? After 8th grade. And I think, people like them, extremely talented painters and artists, school was not cool enough for them. Yeah, so Rigdel eventually ended up going to fine arts school, and right now he's one of the people who's really pushing the limits of expression in a Tibetan way by mixing contemporary painting, abstract art with traditional training. So it's a really interesting kind of phenomenon. And more recently, he also wrote a book of poems. And I think within Tibetan society, people like him and Jamyang and Zundu, who are saying things that are not mainstream, and painting and expressing opinions that are not mainstream, are really pushing Tibetans to sort of look inside and find this kind of other potential that we still need to realize in these new kinds of ways. And I think by doing these, many of these are giving people this kind of, I think, challenging us to look at things in a different way. So I think it's also empowering us in terms of finding new ways to challenge the Chinese government's oppression in Tibet also. So some of the people who are not in these profiles, they are painters inside Tibet, and they are in communication a lot of the times. And if you look at their paintings and some of their works, it becomes clear what they are trying to say under very difficult circumstances. So if you're more interested about these trends, you should talk to Jungbo. Putin Kazun, new book. Do we have this? Probably not. Yeah, I think the book is published by Penguin. One of the Tibetans who grew up and lived in Tibet through the invasion, during the occupation, through the Cultural Revolution, and paid a really heavy price going through their experiences and having different opinions from the Chinese governments. And I think he's one of those people who have recounted in a very objective and yet moving way what his personal life under China's occupation and oppression has been like. Kunga Sayang. So Kunga Sayang, I think just last year, no, actually this year, in March, I have this friend in South India who's a Rinpoche Lama, you know. And Kunga Sayang was a very good friend of that Lama. And this Lama was also very young, I think 27 years old. And he had this whole website and a blog. And he was blogging about all of these new Tibetan writers from inside Tibet who are blogging in Tibetan. And that's a unique kind of, new kind of, really interesting phenomenon, because before, I think 5 or 4 years, until 5 or 4 years ago, we've had this new generation of Tibetans writing in Chinese. People like Wöser and many others who have, you know, challenged the mainstream opinions and also the system by writing in the language of the system. But now there are many writers, new Tibetan writers, who have been educated in Tibet, born and raised, and some of them educated in the monasteries in Amdo, in eastern Tibet. And Kunga Sayang is from Amdo. And he was a monk, I think he's a monk at Labrang Monastery. And many of these people started blogging in Tibetan. And it was really powerful and empowering for a lot of people, because Tibetans, many Tibetans of our age inside Tibet grew up hearing all the time that Tibetan was a dead language. You know, Tibetan, it's over for Tibetan. If you want to be a successful writer, you got to write in Chinese. If you want to be a successful filmmaker, you got to make a film in Chinese. You know, Tibetan, it's finished. Just forget it. Your parents spoke Tibetan, but you're not going to do it. So when we have these new Tibetan writers blogging in Tibetan, because you can read on computer, they would write something and we could read it actually. And we would write comments from here and they could actually read it, thanks to the Unicode programming. So he wrote several essays that were very critical of the Chinese government. And one of the essays he wrote, you know, who is the real splitters? So it's our friend Puchung Sonam, whose picture we saw earlier. He translated his essay into English. So we have this essay on this website, freekunga.org. And you know, a few days after he wrote those essays, we'd been sending the essays back and forth. And suddenly one night, when he was at his home watching VOA TV, you know, Voice of America has this new Tibetan TV program that's really popular inside Tibet. And he was at his home watching it in the middle of the night. And Chinese authorities came to his house and took him away. And since then, he's been in detention. Tunu Wangchen, amateur filmmaker, in the lead up to the Olympics, he really wanted to make a short film that truly expresses the Tibetan people's true opinion and true desires, because many Tibetans felt like we were being misrepresented by the Chinese government using the Olympic stage, and you know, how we were truly feeling were not being projected or expressed to the rest of the world. So he traveled all over Tibet, interviewed hundreds of people, and I think there were like hours and hours of footage. And in the end, he compiled all this footage and gave it to someone who was able to smuggle it out of Tibet on March 10th. And thanks to the successful smuggling of that tape, we have this film called leaving fear behind.